All right, welcome to the ninth episode of the Society of Rugged Developers. Joining me is Lance Vaughn, your friendly co-host. Hey there, Lance, and we got Matt Konda as well joining us. Matt, welcome to the show. Tell us a little bit about how we roped you into the show or why we roped you into the show.
Thanks. Yeah. I guess background on me, I'm a developer who kind of focused into security um, initially by spending a number of years at a security company building software. Um, and then through the process of having applications tested for weaknesses, started to realize I don't write such secure code, and really decided that I wanted to start a mission to kind of help developers do a better job with security. So that's kind of what the shell that I'm coming out of. In terms of rugged, I kind of came across it, I don't know, maybe 18 months ago through you and Josh Corman, and it seemed to fit a lot of what I was trying to bring to developers in terms of helping them envision a secure software, a process and an attitude of building secure software. So what I do professionally is help my customers build secure software. So I do things that are more hands-on than sort of scanning. I don't tend to interpret static analysis. I tend to do code review, architecture review. I sit in stand-ups. I sit in right now I have HipChat, GitHub, Bitbucket, all these tools open that I'm using to collaborate with developers from different partners. And I don't think it's the most efficient way to go about it, but it is rewarding, and I think it's one of the best, most proven ways of actually making apps more secure, because you're kind of really in it with them talking about security. So I guess I'll stop and let you redirect what you're interested in.
Well, I mean,
Yeah,
you
so
had me at GitHub.
yeah, you had me at GitHub. Nice.
Yeah, I think that's great because I think that shows a more pragmatic approach or a more, that's not the right word, integrated approach, right? That's how people are doing modern development, and yet security people often just be like, here's a giant PDF. Thanks for, doing business with us. Write more
I,
secure code, right?
I used to produce those giant PDFs and then process those giant PDFs. And most of the developers I talk to say, I get a list of 150 things, I'll maybe take care of the top 3. And the business owner's on my side about that.
Yeah.
And so I guess it's good that they take care of 3, but it's not really ideal.
So
Yeah.
Matt, I'm curious. How do you find organizations who are looking to implement security in this new profound way, or vice versa? How do you find customers who aren't necessarily locked down in the old ways of approaching security?
That's a great question. A lot of it has to do with interactions. So I'll do educational sessions with prospects, just like intro to the OWASP top 10 or something like that. And it's a way for me to get to know a client or to get to know a prospect. And usually the place where they self-identify as being a good candidate for thinking about rugged or this kind of integrated approach is when their heads start to nod as I say, I bet you have technical security issues that you haven't addressed yet for process reasons, for communication reasons, for whatever else, right? And their heads nod and the managers say, yeah, we could get another report with a whole bunch of new issues, but what we really need is to figure out how to solve them. And to me, because I've done a lot of agile project management, I can engage with the development leaders and the project owners and kind of be part of that process where I'm not telling them you have to do this or you have to do that. I'm kind of almost facilitating a conversation between them. So those are kind of the best scenarios where the companies they know they have issues, they know what they're doing doesn't quite work, and they really just want to talk to each other better.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely.
And when you're working on on this stuff, people are working in more, like you mentioned, agile, right? And I think part of that is the reason why people are more interested in rugged or kind of a new approach to security. It's because people don't want to do the security testing like end of life cycle when it's already produced. And there is that struggle whenever you do get the giant 300-page PDF, and it's like, what do you fix? How do you fix it? It's not a trivial issue, and I don't know. Part of some of the thinking that I've always felt is like being outside of the actual real development cycle of how stuff actually gets built, and it's like, okay, well, that giant PDF equals some random things we'll just shove maybe in the backlog, maybe in the we don't know what to do with it bucket, right? Because there's not like actionable tests written around it. There's not actionable, it's not being assigned properly. I don't know. As people start to grapple with, okay, we have these technical security issues. We know they exist. We know we keep having them, and they're a pure agile shop. Do they want to, like, is the desire more kind of like you're pushing that, or they're saying, hey, we want to actually address this? And I don't know. I mean, does that make sense? Like, is it a push versus pull scenario with that when they're working in these kind of environments?
Well, it's kind of like judo or something. You push a little bit and then they pull. One of the reasons I like rugged is because it's something that developers can identify with. The manifesto is, something that they're familiar with from kind of the Agile manifesto. It makes sense on its face. Nobody's going to go out there and be like, no, I don't want to write rugged code. It just doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
So you kind of push them a little bit, and then they pull you in where, well, how do we actually do this? And in some ways, the trickiest thing about sort of Agile is it's never been done the same twice. So you have to let the organization define where they want to start, and engage with them in ways that maybe are out of your comfort zone. But there are a lot of people, I think, starting to do this, and including things like Code Climate and Brakeman. There are a lot of interesting ways to build continuous kind of tooling into projects so that you don't have to wait until the end of a 3-month release cycle to start testing. People want to release code every day, so you have to find a way to test every day.
Not everyone wants to release code every day. And the developers do, right? But the organizations don't always.
That is true.
But I get your point. So is that what rugged is then, Matt? Is it that continuous tooling, continuous integration, continuous everything, continuous?
I think it's partly the continuous part of it. I think it's partly because that is part of a cultural adoption. When you're saying, hey, I'm going to be rugged, what you're trying to say is, I'm going to do what's necessary on a day in and day out basis to be tough, to make my software tough. I think that's how I think about it. And developers respond really well when you use the analogy to regular bugs, where if you find a bug very late in a development project, it can be very hard to fix, or it could be widespread, where it's been copied and pasted everywhere in the code base. Where if you find it much earlier, you can often nip that in the bud and kind of course correct right when you're first writing the code. I can give you a kind of an anecdote about that. I just today I was doing some code review on an application that interacts with an SAP backend, and sort of the front end is this middle tier, and it's processing input, and the SAP folks sort of said, well, any string input you give us is going to be secure because SAP secures it, right? But that meant that the development team that was working on the code I was looking at basically didn't do any sanitization or validation of the strings that are going through in like a search query, for example. So the first time I see that, if I'm doing a little bit of code review every week, which is what it's like for this project, I can raise the question to the team that includes the product owners that are writing the front-end code and the developers that are writing the sort of SAP layer, and say, hey, we first said we don't have to worry about this, but it looks like it could present an issue to me. Let's talk about it. And then if there is an issue, let's plan it. To me, one of the biggest problems with security in application development is it's never estimated. It's never built in to your stories in a way that a developer can say I did or I did not do it. Right? You have sometimes acceptance criteria about validation of certain fields, but you rarely have, did we think about security for this story, sort of soup to nuts. And one of the other things I did with that same client that was really pretty powerful, I thought, was introduce the idea of a villain persona, right? It's very hard to think about security without thinking about what could go wrong or what specifically is going to happen. And the nice thing is, I'm literally in, version 1, which is an agile planning tool, looking at stories, and I push in, like, here's how I would try to take advantage of this feature in a way that, is using it against the way you intend for it to be used, but might give me some kind of benefit, like, shipping some product to me instead of you or something like that. Mm-hmm. And having that sort of villain persona, I think, helps the developers to have sort of a continuous idea of, oh, there is someone else out there. And same for the product owners, right? It makes it a little bit more real for them. And then, actually, it's kind of funny. You'd be surprised how fast companies will come and say, well, we've had this kind of problem in the past where someone did something that was fraudulent through our system. How should we prevent that? And I'm going to go one more minute, but
please.
The really cool way that one of those discussions played out, the client was describing a situation where customers were sharing logins to the system with other people, and so you couldn't really keep track of who was ordering what, and they were potentially going to different locations. And they asked me, like, so how can we prevent people from logging in or from sharing IDs? And I said, well, there are a couple different things you could do. You could sort of at the first step just cancel the session that's already open when the next person logs in. That's not a very strong deterrent, but it is inconvenient. It might discourage people from doing that. But another thing you could do is two-factor. You could start to say, we're going to send a text to a phone, and you have to know the code to be able to access the system, right? And that makes it much harder to share logins. Well, the cool thing about this discussion was the business owners immediately said, that's a great idea, but we could never ask our clients to do that, the two-factor, right? Mm-hmm. That's not what we need for this system. And to me, one of the parts that's very hard for security, and it's not, Rugged has the same, I think, challenges, is you kind of have to choose your battles and let the business have their say about what's important.
Sure.
But what you have to do is communicate with them where there are potential issues, so that they can make informed decisions about that. And so that's where some of this embedding security in the project team pays dividends, because you can explain in the context of a screen or a feature to a business user that otherwise doesn't care about security what the potential impact of a problem might be. And they can make a decision right there, and you can kind of get everybody bought into the same solution. And now I'm really going to stop talking again.
I think you hit on several points that are very useful to think about. I love the idea of doing a villain persona, having hostile user stories kind of in your agile systems. I agree with you on the, I agree, and I'm also, I also think it's part of the problem, right? It's like security took, and this is my little 1/2 second or half a minute monologue here or whatever. So sorry, Lance. But
time's up.
Yeah, but you go back and you think about like where security has been kind of through the ages, and you see how security has sort of separated itself from actual engineering in the 90s, kind of came about into this whole like risk and audit and compliance, and then really started reorientating their value in the business to compliance and legal type satisfactory means, instead of actually and this is hand wavy, not 100% true for everybody everywhere, but business value alignment has been seen as like, okay, if we get it, these people here will be PCI compliant and we'll be able to, be HIPAA or SOX or yada yada yada. And so we start putting this organization together that fits that need, where really there is that whole piece of like people want to perform fraudulent actions against us. There's issues that are going on, and I would say the engineering that we do sometimes has this problem, where we come in and we say, oh, you have cross-site scripting, and people are like, sweet, a little pop-up box. Oh, we have some sort of injection or whatever, right? And or forceful browsing or yada yada, right? And so people see that, and in the business, what does that mean? That means nothing, right? It means like, oh, well, that's on the browser side for cross-site scripting, right, or something like that. It's like that's nothing wrong with our system. That's their, and so we'll just accept that risk. And I think there is a trend of accepting the risk that we have let go on for like way too long, and it has sort of, and we've done it for the legal compliance audit thing to say, okay, well, they don't want to fix that, so fair enough, right? How do you kind of move in an organization where you have people just saying, yeah, we'll accept those risks, we'll accept those risks, we'll accept those risks? How do you move to actually putting code to fix the problems or trying to do some correction there in organizations like that? I know that was a long-winded question, but does that make sense?
It's a great question, and I do agree with your point. I think that, to me, the best way to communicate, so there's sort of two ways that security folks have handled that, right? One is we let people accept the risk. The other is we gloom and doom and say everything is broken, right? And in some ways, they actually reinforce each other, because as a business user, you either think, well, no matter what I do, I'm going to be in a problem, or, this can't be that bad, I'm not going to worry about it. And so I think the trick is to provide more of a real-world example of what could happen. And I could think of a couple examples specifically, like I have one customer where, some of their site is using SSL, but not all of it, right? Well, they don't necessarily understand that the browser is still sending session tokens, even though it's not a secure session, right? And so you have to kind of explain, well, if you're in Starbucks, right, and somebody's sitting there, they can basically go in as you without almost any work, right? You have to turn it into a real problem. With developers in cross-site scripting, I used to think the exact same thing you described, which is, it's kind of a hilarious example, right? Oh, you got cross-site scripting, it's a pop-up. Why would anybody do that? It just makes their browser look bad. So what I do with developers is I'll show them Beef, which is a browser exploitation tool, and then I show them popping up Facebook credentials or turning on a webcam, right? Those are things that people care about. So I think that's where the high touch, sort of more embedded security resource in a team is invaluable, because you can contextualize the finding, right? It's not just, oh, it's injection, right? It's injection, but it would be really hard to get, and there's other things we could do to mitigate it, and et cetera, right? Or, no, this is a really big deal. Here's the worst case. Here's what could happen. We have data to suggest that it's going to happen sooner or later, right? Another message I try to bring to organizations I work with is you have to understand the state of automation, right? So many of these attacks are weaponized within days of being discovered now, that if you don't have a plan for responding as the software you're using gets patched, you just don't have a chance. And that's something that's kind of a big cultural shift for some people. I know for me, like, I'll build a new Rails app, I'll be like, okay, let me get the app composer, I'll never update Rails once I start. Or in Java, I'll be like, oh, here's my full Spring stack, I'm going to use all that, define the versions, and I never really think about it until a year later, and I'm like, oh, well, I want this feature of Spring later. It's not because I want to be secure, it's because I want a new feature that I update that stack. And so, kind of a long-winded answer, I think you have to give people real-world scenarios. and B, it's not likely, but it could happen, or here's how we need to figure out whether it's likely. I mean, you may not be able to answer the question about whether it's likely or not. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So what's interesting about the direction that this conversation is going, and Josh Corman played on this or commented on this a couple of weeks ago with us, but and I can't quote him. I don't have the quote in front of me. It was on 2 episodes ago, episode 7. But he said, the majority of the work behind Rugged it's really a soft skills thing versus a hard skills thing. It's a lot about communication and convincing leadership and decision makers within an organization to embrace more of a proactive approach towards security. And yet on the other hand, James, you and I were trying to make this podcast one that is pragmatic, more about specifically the how, right? So, and I'm not trivializing the conversation that you guys are having, because it really is. I mean, if you can't make the decision makers agree that this is a worthwhile expenditure of our time and their resources or their money, then it'll never happen. So clearly, as part of these, as rugged pioneers, if you will, we need to be able to have those soft skills and have those conversations, right? Would you agree with Josh's take?
Yeah, well, let me inject there too. Like, I think
Okay.
I love how, like, first thing you ask, hey Matt, like, what's rugged, right? And you say it is part of the cultural integration, cultural fabric that we need to be, a part of. And I think that, a lot of things we're talking about are cultural issues, but I think they also have, like, pragmatic things behind them, right? Like creating a villain persona, right? Or creating, hostile user story. So it may not have, actual, code samples, but I think there's some patterns that we could discern out of this. And I find the thing, and I'll let you respond to Lance's question, but I do find that whole point about the letting people accept the risk and the spreading kind of fear among the team, like, and having that reinforce each other, kind of being a circle. I think that is very, I think that's true, and we see that a lot in organizations. And it does kind of move into that pushing stuff into actual practical examples. So I love the things, kind of some of the stuff you've been saying here.
Yeah, agreed.
And Lance, I also agree. I think that one of the real challenges for people who are trying to do rugged with projects is that there's no kind of cookie cutter, here's how you do it. We can talk about a number of the things I do or try to do, but I can never go into a customer and say, here's what I'm going to do ahead of time. I have, like, a menu, maybe, right? A list of things I could do. Sometimes they tell me what they want to do, and it's totally different, right? And
I find rugged to be very similar in, like, to the DevOps world, right? It's like, DevOps has the fortune or misfortune, depending on who you ask. It's like people associate tools like Chef or Puppet with it, right? And it's like that equals DevOps, But most DevOps people would say the same thing that you have just said about rugged, right? It's cultural shift. It is there's a multiple levels of things that kind of are involved in, like, doing DevOps, and I think rugged is very similar in that way. Maybe we need some more tooling. I'd love to kind of. I know you've done some work doing actual user interactions and writing some unit tests or, like, integration type tests for that, and I'd love to talk to you more about that as we go. But yeah, I think that is an issue. So, I mean, let's move into that if we could kind of jump in practical side.
Sure.
Yeah, I definitely. I'd love to do that. So so I know, Matt, you love to talk to your customers, as well as you do a lot in the community, talking about ways that different ways of incorporating security into the software development lifecycle. Maybe you can just give us a high level of why that's important, kind of bring it into the rugged conversation, and then we can drill down.
Well, I guess one interesting question you could ask yourself is, can you be a rugged developer on a team that's not rugged?
I believe so. I mean, you can certainly try, right? Can you successfully do it? And perhaps not. Maybe you have to beat some people up.
Well, so to me, the reason that the reason that I've sort of sought out developer conferences to do talks is really because I think that there's sort of you have to push to get to a point where security becomes part of what people expect as part of their job, right? Whether that's rugged or whether that's just people are aware of it. At some point, developers have to know more about security than they do now. And that can happen in a bunch of ways. One of the things I like about the framing of rugged is that to me, it feels like you're empowering developers to build code securely. You're helping them feel good about it, as opposed to like knocking them down for the mistakes that they routinely make. Does that make sense?
Yep.
And so, to me, part of the reason I'm out trying to do talks is because I want to get people to start to think about it routinely to set the stage for more rugged work, right? Where sort of thinking as a team that we're going to do this and we're going to do it better, and we're going to incorporate these specific things, which we should jump into next, to help make sure it's rugged. To me, they won't do that unless there's a little bit of a consciousness around security, or there are sort of visionary people who are, asking them to do it. And so part of it is just sort of trying to make that more of a common belief that security is part of our responsibility as developers. Yeah, go ahead.
About 2008, 2009, I went to a talk, and I can't remember the guy's name who gave it, but it was about agile, doing security in an agile environment, right? And he promoted the idea of having a security buddy, right? That's like he kind of knew that like security people are viewed as jerks throughout the whole organization. Nobody wants to work with them, and they're blockers and not actually like builders of functionality, and like they're so tied to the waterfall methodology that it's just like worthless to use. But he said, as a security person, try to be the security buddy, right? And like try to put yourself on the team. And so to answer the question of like, can you be rugged without having a rugged team? I think you have to have that cultural shift that you're talking about, like that whole same, kind of the flip of saying like security is expected, like our users want it, we have to have it, and it comes easier at organizations where there's been a lot of pressure, there's been attacks and problems where they face that. But if let's say you're trying to start at an organization that's new, or you're trying to build this in place with an existing team, I think taking that buddy style approach where you kind of come alongside the organization, probably much like what you do in a lot of organizations you work with. I don't know. I like that idea. And let's just assume that that's like a normal, or let's say that's like somebody wanted to go into an organization and do that. Maybe they find themselves already on a team or going into a new team. But what are the things that they would do, or that you have done that you've seen work successfully, to start implementing in kind of the team, either in the code or in the agile processes, or like what are the kind of stuff that you would see?
So let's put you in the scenario, Matt, that I was in today, where I released a single line of code, and now QA has to test the crap out of it for 2 weeks before it makes its way to production. How do you make that kind of cultural change? Even though I've been pounding on them for 2 years to see the light, it may never happen, right? So sure, I can be rugged in my line of work and doing my own testing and making sure that I'm writing great code, but the organization itself, it may just always work at a snail's pace in that situation.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think. Those seemed like almost two different questions to what I was listening to, but
yeah.
You can start with
I love the security buddy. I think when we first did the Builders versus Breakers talk, we did it at a B-Sides Chicago, and it was inspired by Brett Harden, who did a talk about being the fixer, where basically people fix code. I can't remember exactly where he was at the time. So I love the idea of being of developing the idea of a security buddy, but to make the kind of cultural shift, you kind of need to be more than a buddy. You need to have sort of concrete things you can suggest and then get people bought into. And you have to be relentless. I mean, on some level, you just have to say, people need to eventually see it to believe it, and you can't take people's frustration as a reason to stop. So, for example, I mean, talking about specific things that we have done, that I've done with customers. One simple one is building checklists into stories that are security related. So, if you're building a mobile app where there's sort of an iOS app, an Android app, and a .NET app, .NET backend, let's say, right? Maybe you have a checklist for each group of developers that's working in those different technologies that is specific to them, such that they can, when they're closing a story, say, check, 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 check. I thought about, what kind of strings I'm allowing to be rendered in this web view, let's just say. Or, I thought about how I'm validating this input to make sure that it doesn't become, potential injection later. And it's not going to work 100%, but it's sort of a very good partner to training. A lot of organizations do a very shallow job of training, and that's partly because it costs a lot of money to get people together for a long time, and a lot of training is not so great, to be honest. But if you give people a way to find relevant information about the exact thing you're talking about in the code they're writing, and it's hyperlinked right from their story, they can dive in and check, like, oh, did I do this? If I need more information, I can just follow the link. It's right there, and they can sort of educate themselves as they go. Again, it's not foolproof, but it's a piece that can help.
I was preparing for you to talk about checklists, so I brought my my copy of the checklist manifesto, which is still unread, but it's on the list here. That the great thing about this book, is that it's written by a medical doctor, and I think the stuff that's going on in the medical industry is very similar to the stuff that we face here, right? And it's in that it's dictated by journals and conferences and kind of academic papers that are released, and then they kind of diffused from on high into actual, practitioner offices, surgical areas, operation rooms, and you're taking a very complicated body of knowledge, and you're distilling it to the actual emergency situations, right? Like somebody's coming in and they have different medical criteria, different medical crisis that's happening, and there needs to be a certain level of response within a certain amount of time. The checklist kind of needs to go into effect, and so the idea around checklists is a great idea for keeping people alive, and they credit a lot of numbers of lives saved, good treatments rendered, surgeries, surgical mistakes fixed due to using checklists and procedures that are shared, distilled bodies of knowledge, and I love that idea in kind of in practice and thinking about the similarities between dealing with a very complex system, which is what we're doing with our software and systems, and to kind of the human body and the complex systems that we are running as well. And I like that this kind of came not from the technology field, but it came from the medical field. But what do you think? Like, I mean, how do you tell people, or how do you move in that direction of writing good checklists? I know OWASP provides some sort of default checklists. I've been thinking more and more how do you build checklists for that have meaning and representation inside of an organization that kind of and capture both maybe like stuff we've had happen to us before, but like good practices and like as you're bringing new people on the team, doing that. Um, where are some ways? I know you're saying you build them around mobile apps and different kind of frameworks, but do you build them around like segments of the application, or they're shared things? Like how does that work?
Well, so I think the most important thing is that I could write checklists in a day or two and feel great about them, and they would never ever be adopted by development teams, right? So I'm almost embarrassed to tell you how long it took to actually develop real checklists for it turns out it was a very large development team. I mean, they were probably hundreds of developers that were going to end up using them, right? But probably the single most important thing is to not dictate how it's going to be done, but to get feedback from the developers. On top of that, making it very easy to access additional content, making the checklist as concise as possible. You want it to be actionable just by looking at the checklist description or the item description without having to go anywhere. But you want to give people something they can go look at. And when you give them something they can go look at, you want to give them examples of code that look like their code. I typically try to give them both a positive and a negative example, because if you do that, they can kind of identify, okay, this was how not to do it, and this is the way to fix it. You're giving them, the information that they need to actually implement the checklist item. But in terms of which items, yeah, I mean, definitely OWASP is a great resource. To be honest, a lot of Apple and Google documentation is great for Android and iOS platforms. But if you just sent a developer to the book, right, or the full documentation, it's not going to be very useful. So part of it is kind of curating that content and giving them specifics, sort of targeted links. And so to me, that was the key to that working. If you just give them the OWASP top 10 and don't talk to them, it's never going to ever work. Don't get me wrong. I mean, I love the OWASP top 10. I'm a big fan, but it's just that's not a checklist,
Yeah, and that's been the traditional approach, I think.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, here's the OWASP whatever, and it's like people will ignore that. Yeah. Okay. So I think checklists, and then how do you relate those to items in your like your development task or things like that? Are those related? Are those segmented? How does that play in?
Well, so in this case, we actually integrated the checklists with the Agile planning tool so that they were on stories. So that anytime somebody was completing a story, it was basically mandatory that they complete the checklist. That might be draconian for some environments. I'm not necessarily advocating that everywhere. But the other side of that is, some stories really need to have security be front and center and thought about. And so that's where, to me, identifying kind of a baseline of security requirements during the project inception, which is something that's really fun to do if you've ever done like an agile project inception and sat with the business owners and the developers while they talk through all the features. It's a very dynamic and kind of awesome process. Well, having security at the table just makes sense, right? You're helping them think about what their baseline is going to be for security. Now, to make that a little bit more concrete, things I've done as deliverables out of an inception week, right? Because you're not getting any security features delivered as part of the inception, right? We're not writing any code, we're just talking, right? But what I'll deliver are like a visual threat model, a very simplified, like, here's what I think threat looks like for you, right? You're going to be a target, you need to be worried, or you're not going to be a target, or you have really sensitive data or you don't, right? Very sort of simplified threat analysis. But then also, like, by the time you're done with inception, often you know sort of what technology the developers are going to use. And so I'll write like a security guidelines document for them, which points them to resources they should know about. So, for example, in Rails, I might point them to CanCan. In Java, I might point them to JASIP, which they can use to encrypt passwords on the file system. Right. So you give them some guidelines. You point them to any mean, the other thing is you have to be asking questions, right? So you say to this client, what are your password requirements for this application, right? Like, let's get those noted down before we start writing anything. So because you've done that as part of the requirements, you can start, whenever you're writing stories, to estimate with security built into the scope of the story, right? If you're building it for 10 story points and you add some complicated security thing, the developer's going to say, hey, that's hard. A great example that from an app I was working with, it's sort of a very standard thing in Rails, actually. You register and you get a period of time before you have to confirm your registration, let's say, right? And you basically get an email with a link that has a GUID in it that expires. Well, we were going back and forth over whether that would, the expiry was a necessary component of that. And the developers were saying, hey, that's going to be hard. It's going to take more work to do that. And again, the business could say that part's not as important, as long as we review them periodically or we have some other process for dealing with it. So to me, like, one of the biggest parts of having security present at the project discussions, whether it's the inception or like stand up or sprint meetings, is that you get to bring out those nuances in a forum where there's a discussion about them, and the developers don't get screwed by being asked to do something awesome when they're given no time to do it.
Yeah, so when you get to estimating, Matt, if we can drill down into that a little bit, I know are you typically providing estimates for the ruggedization or for the security concerns completely separate from the storied user points or the user stories?
Well, we try not to. I try to make the story, the definition of done for the story, mean that it's tested and secure. That's what I try to do. And so what that means is I need to give the developers enough information that they can understand how to implement what I'm talking about and estimate it. So I actually don't usually estimate the security work on a given story because it's one of the fundamental parts of Agile is developers have to own their estimates, right? You want developers to feel like they committed to whatever they said they committed to. And so if I go in and say, oh, it should take you a day to add this, that's not going to be a good thing. Now, there are projects where I'm building something that's complementing the overall product, and in that case, yes, I'll estimate those stories. Right. But you kind of want the team, in my view, you kind of want the team to feel like a rugged story is a secure, performant story, tested story. And you don't want to kind of get into, oh, that happens later, because later never happens.
Right. Okay. And what about testing and automation? How do you inject security in a rugged fashion during the testing and automation phase? And maybe this is the easiest one to answer.
There are a couple of different ways and answers, and I think this is another area where everybody does it differently. From a pure testing perspective, I mean, I think in the past 3 years, every team I've worked with has some tests. But I will say that almost every team I've worked with writes very good happy path tests. They test the case that they want to work. And then they test a case that doesn't work, maybe, right? But they're not necessarily very creative about how they come up with the cases that are not going to work. So one of the things that I can do with teams when I'm embedded with them is say, well, what about if I send something that's not just not valid, but that's malicious? Or, I mean, cross-site scripting is a great, simple example where if I give you data that's got scripting in it, right, are you going to encode that or not? It's so easy to test that, it's almost degenerate. But a lot of developers won't do that. Now, I've had partners where they end up writing relatively significant Selenium suites that do that for every field by field, because the nature of the app was that they were actually generating a lot of content in JavaScript, which is kind of terrifying. So they did the right thing and built a very healthy testing suite for security issues. In terms of automation, it's kind of becoming almost, I think, sort of commonly understood to be best practice to do either continuous integration or nightly builds or some sort of very early, frequent feedback for, building artifacts out of your project. Now, most of the projects I work with run their tests as part of that build. So if you can do the security tests, you're getting some level of awareness just from having those tests run. But a lot of those build systems you can actually integrate more things with, right? So you can start to use, with Rails, you can use Brakeman. You can start to do analysis with PMD in Java land. You can get tools that will help you identify potential issues and make it part of your team process to review those and identify which ones are real. So that's kind of how testing and automation works. Some people do, automated scanning, like either static analysis or dynamic analysis, or port scanning, or all kinds of things. And I definitely advocate doing all of those. It's so different from every organization to every organization. It's sort of figure out which tools are working for you and try to make them give you feedback early and often. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and you did a talk on this. Let's see, it was called Insecure Expectations, right?
Yeah, so that was kind of a fun talk. I did. I built an app that intentionally had a number of security vulnerabilities in it, and then I used Cucumber and Selenium to drive browser-driven tests that exposed the security flaws. So as a developer, you could basically clone the one project and then run the tests from the other project and watch your browser blow by blow, exploit the security vulnerabilities, and it made it very sort of real. It's really more of an example of what you could do than a tool that you could use to secure your application, as it were. You'd have to do a lot of manual work, but it shows ways that you could do it. Particularly with Rails apps, it'd be very easy to take it and run with it.
Yeah, well, and it's nice because I like your. I think you're right about teams. Will do a lot of happy path versus kind of bad path or attacking path. And that, I think that is one of those things that definitely needs to be embedded. And I like the idea of taking that as a piece. What about like where people are not even really doing this sort of integration type testing, like, or we're doing just like more unit tests or sticking that, like, how do you approach teams that, let's say, they're not even in that new era of continuous integration, or think unit tests are enough?
I guess one of the things that I did in that talk we just mentioned was suggest the idea of delivering findings from a security analysis as a test. So show them something that actually does the interaction that causes the problem, and let them sort of see it in action, instead of sort of just advocating for it. It's hard because getting people to adopt automation is it's good for so many different reasons, but it's hard for a lot of reasons too. And maybe you start with a piece. There's a component you can do. All of this, and this is why I think Lance may have alluded to this earlier, right? Like being rugged is so much more of like an attitude. It's like a approach, right? You can't take your whole app and make it rugged. Maybe you have a whole bunch of services behind your app. You can't make the whole thing rugged in one effort, right? A lot of it is figuring out how to work with the developers and the operational teams to break it into pieces and then push each one of those forward. And it's not about getting to an endpoint. I mean, obviously you want the app to be as secure as you can get it, but it's about advancing it practically as much as you can in a real way. So in the case of a team that's not willing to use integration, maybe you start with a piece of it and just build a couple of automated tests and try to make that easy for them. or come up with examples of organizations that are doing that well. But I mean, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that I haven't failed at that also, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? Because in the way people are doing stuff, it's like it feels like, well, everyone would want to do that, but there's still people that are hesitant to even do that level of automation. And so, yeah, I think the idea of taking pieces and farming them out is a good piece. Yeah, it's hard, I think.
So Matt, one of the things that you do is you report to your client site and you get embedded with the development teams. In those scenarios, I imagine you're doing pairing and code reviews. Can you just give us a little anecdote or give us a little snapshot into the life of Matt Konda and some of the things that you run into when you're pairing and are embedded with these development teams?
Well, I guess kind of the first step with pairing is you almost have to you sort of have to earn somebody's trust and confidence, and that's one of the reasons why this model is hard to implement, and probably one of the reasons why I enjoy doing it, because you have to be pretty good using the technology you're using to build, to pair with someone and not slow them down a lot, or to do code review and have relevant feedback. So to me, one of the big challenges engaging with a team that's doing this is, getting them bought into, hey, my input is important and I have a perspective that's helpful, and but I'm not going to make them do things that they don't want to do or can't do, or just sort of tell them what to do, right? So one of the things I always do when I'm pairing or doing code review is I frame everything as a question, right? I'm never going to go in and say, hey, here's a problem, you screwed this up, you got to fix it, right? I'll never even say, hey, here's a definite problem, right? I actually have been burned by that. I'll say, hey, it looks to me like possibly authentication is missing here. Can you tell me where it's happening? Or what would happen if something like this input came in? And usually the developers will sit there and sort of step through it with you, and then like a light bulb will go off and they'll be like, oh, we don't stop that, and so a lot of it is how you engage with developers. I think it's very interesting. I think a lot of people in the security community, for better or for worse, have sort of a strong ego approach.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm the elite hacker or whatever. And to me, like, the most important thing you could do with developers is just sit and talk to them, let them ask you a question. And so when you're doing code review, you have to come up with real things, and you have to do it fast, right? You have to actually know what you're doing. I won't do code review for technologies I'm not comfortable in, like Django, for example. It's just not something I know. I just won't do it because they should find somebody who's an expert in Django, right? But once you earn their trust and frame things as questions, people can actually take your input, and it becomes a great training opportunity. That's one of the reasons, actually, I think code review is one of my favorite things to do, because it's so contextual that it turns your code review into like a little example from a training, and you have a dialogue about it. The other thing I won't do in a code review is throw a developer under the bus, right? So I'll say, hey, I've been there, I've done that, I've introduced cross-site scripting, SQL injection, I've introduced all these kinds of problems. I'm not proud of it. I'd like to do better now, but I don't blame you for doing it. Let's just fix it. Because, I don't know, at least in my experience, developers don't respond very well if you just tell them they're wrong.
So here we go with
does,
soft skills
really?
again, right? Interesting.
Okay. I think that. I mean, to me, that's very inspirational. And Matt, you definitely are kind of a unique unicorn of the security world, right? Because like a lot of people don't take that approach, and that is, I think that's the detriment and the downfall. It's not a technology issue. It's not a organizational issue. Sometimes I think it's just a pure attitude, and like the security industry has sort of taken that that attitude that, like, idiot developers can't figure this out, right? And
Right.
I've got root on your box because of this. It's like, and it's just not a very positive way especially when you're on the building side.
Right.
And we're trying to make things better. So yeah, that's
Well,
cool. I think that's a great way to do it. And I know Lance has a lot of experience with pairing, but in all the times I've done pairing, it's like been really helpful and really useful. So yeah, you should write a book on like security pairing, how to do it.
Well, I also see pairing. Every time I'm pairing, it's an opportunity to learn something.
Yeah.
how to be a nice guy, right? I mean, really, what you're doing is you're fostering a culture of trust and productive collaboration. So again, this gets back to soft skills. So I think we've kind of stumbled on a rugged truth here. Josh Corman initially brought it up 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, and Matt is certainly driving it home today. But that being rugged requires soft skills, whether you're trying to implement something at an organization or team level, or just sit down with a dev and help them improve their code. You're not gonna do it successfully if you're an ass, I guess. But then secondly, Matt, I'd like to go back and revisit your question, and I'd like to know what your answer is, right? You asked me earlier, can you be rugged on a team that's not rugged?
I guess when I asked you, my thinking was definitely not. I appreciate where you were coming from, so I'm glad I asked, because I would applaud any individual developer taking steps to be more rugged. I think that's a step in the process toward having teams be rugged, right? Everybody's not going to just all get rugged at once. On the other hand, to me, when you're talking about cultural fabric or sort of the collective expectation that we're going to deliver performant, secure, quality software, that's something that, I mean, to me, when you read the Rugged Manifesto, it's about the team all has to believe that. You can't do it unless everybody's somewhat bought in. And so that's where I think a lot of the emphasis when you're doing things that are trying to make security happen, they need to be somewhat based on team building.
Yeah.
In addition to any of these technical analysis things are useful, but it's a lot about team building and getting people on the same page about what the goal is.
Yeah. And James and I, going back early in our earlier conversations, one of our first podcasts, we talk about the different rugged attributes and how those different attributes can manifest in an individual developer, or can manifest in a team or an organization, but then also they can manifest in the product itself. So perhaps your question is really more, can we produce rugged code if we as an organization or a team are not rugged? And I would challenge you that, I'll agree with you that probably not, right? But you got to go out there and fight the good fight. And just because you're around a bunch of people that suck, that can't bring you down. You've got to step up and be rugged yourself, because awesome can be contagious if you do it right. And this gets back to the soft skills.
I love that.
Awesome. Yeah, Lance, awesome can be contagious, and I'm thinking
I just made that up,
buddy. I'm catching it from you.
All right, cool, guys. Well, I think we're out of time. Is there anything else, Matt? And we want to just kind of throw you a bone here and give you an opportunity to bring anything up.
Yeah, and tell us about, like, okay, somebody watched this. They are totally like, okay, I can't believe that these guys are speaking my language. This is what I want to do in my organization. This is how I want to transform it. This is what I want to be about. Like, what do people do now? Like, where can they find some past talks you've given? What would you recommend people reading, watching, jumping in?
Well, obviously, I would start with the rugged, pages, but then I can put links to a number of talks in the show notes so that you guys can distribute that. I have a website, Gemrai. It's a combination of Jedi and Samurai, where I blog about a lot of this kind of stuff. I'm at Konda on Twitter. You could talk to me, and I would love to talk about this. You know, one of the awesome things for me about carving out this space for myself is like I actually just feel good about what I'm doing. I love it. So like I love when people reach out to me and say, hey, can we talk about something, secure software development, this and that. I just love to get in and engage and talk to people. And so, you know, I don't know, I do a fair amount of it, probably more than I should, gratis, just because I like the direction and I feel strongly about it. So I wouldn't hesitate to reach out to me. Obviously, I think you guys deserve a lot of the credit for pulling the show together and bringing the attention to Rugged, and I'm sure you could also be great resources. I do want to say, you can't be rugged by wearing flannel, having a beard, and wearing work boots, let's say.
Yeah. What about cool glasses?
You look scary.
You gotta have some cowboy boots. We're in Austin, man. You gotta have cowboy boots.
That was my attempted. That was attempted a joke at the.
Yeah, didn't work.
No, sorry.
We'll edit that part out.
Yeah.
Well, Matt, we really appreciate having you on the show. I imagine we're probably going to ask you to come back and do some more with us, because this is really good stuff, and I know our viewers, all 5 of them, will really be excited about it. And that was a good joke, right? So, but I think this is good stuff, and this is where we're heading as an industry, and so we're excited about the journey. And thanks so much for sharing the time with us, and keep up the work you're doing. Really good stuff.
Yeah, thanks, Matt.
Thank you. It was fun.
All right. Bye, guys.
Cool. All right. Bye-bye. See you next week.